All right, so the lecture for this week, I'm actually going to combine my discussion of the PBS special you watched, The House We Live In, From Race to Power of an Illusion, and then the context lecture that I normally give. So this is going to cover both of those, and then you'll have two separate shorter videos talking about the really short readings from the 1619 project. The video thankfully does a great job of digging into a lot of the historical context, which is why I assigned it, as well as some of the broader, kind of larger significance of looking at housing segregation. But I wanted to flesh some of that out and tailor some of this to what we'll be looking at in the next couple of weeks. So before we kind of jump into that, I think, for last week you read Harriet Jacobs, and you looked at the way Blackness was kind of policed and made to behave within the space of the plantation under slavery. But you also got to see the ways that, Jacobs and people like her created meaning and familial relationships and resisted that as well, right? So that early kind of understanding of Black geography is something that McKittrick talked about. And then you looked at the way that connected to all the way to today with the story of Junior Provost, right? But we really started with kind of that history of slavery and what Blackness in space looked like, the relationship between Blackness and space was then. I want to make sure I at least give you some context into what happened between then and when we get to the early 20th century, looking at government policy and housing and geographic segregation, especially when it comes to kind of urban and suburban spaces. So first, let's dig into a little bit of context of just what happened between slavery and kind of the Great Migration. So post-Civil War context, you obviously all know by now the 13th Amendment. You know that it legally ended plantation slavery, right? I think almost all of you have seen the documentary 13th, or you've read the new Jim Crow, or you've had, some encounter where you understand that plantation slavery, chattel slavery ended with the 13th Amendment, but we still have slavery going on in the U.S. Often a lot of our made in the U.S. products that we get are cheap because of free and or highly kind of exploitatively cheap labor from prisoners or imprisoned people. I think right now the biggest debate people are having is looking at what's happening on the West Coast. As someone who's lived 10 years on the West Coast before moving back to the Midwest, we have all the wildfires that I'm sure you're seeing in the news and the skies are red. Well, before the pandemic, typically the kind of labor of imprisoned people was used to put out those fires, right? And again, these people are receiving nothing or very little money, right? So 13th Amendment is good to know that yes, we had that change. It got rid of chattel slavery, and you read some of the conditions of that in Jacob's text, but I just want to make it abundantly clear that it didn't get rid of slavery altogether. This is going to be important, and the reason why I'm harping on this is in a second we'll talk about how that distinction shaped a lot of the ways that Black people were made to behave in certain spaces and played a large role in why people began migrating to cities. So we'll circle back to that. You do know, Black Americans became citizens finally. You saw in that video, some of the contestation of first only people who were deemed white were able to have citizenship and power, and what that meant for other different groups of people of color. But African Americans became citizens in 1866. So all of this happens at the same time, meaning now we don't have legal plantation slavery and African Americans are citizens. That leaves a big hole or a vacuum in power. One, it leaves a vacuum in power for people who, we just got reading in Jacobs, not just slave owners, but also the poor whites who enjoyed having that power over Black people, right? So that there's kind of a vacuum with white supremacy of power. It also leaves a big economic hole because we know that people who were enslaved were a big driving force, especially for the economies of the South. So the solution to that for a lot of people in power was to create what are called the Black Codes and the Pig Laws. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit more in a second and show you a short clip from PBS that does a great job of explaining those. But essentially, those were laws that were passed to regain that labor force. So it meant creating laws that police different Black behaviors, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and made it very easy then to say, oh, you've done something that is now a felony, so you're going to be in prison, which, surprise, surprise, that can make you legally a slave again. And we literally had former cotton plantations were then converted into prisons, or had people who were in prison sent to go pick the cotton. So it was a pretty quick turnover, right? So much so that, between in the South and certain counties, you had the prison population, which used to be 10% Black, and on many counties got as high as 90% Black, right? So this was kind of a drastic way that people found these loopholes to deal with emancipation. So that's one driving force that encouraged a lot of folks to say, I need to get out of the South. I need to find a place where I'm not going to have to abide by these laws. And so that, a lot of people, and you see these images, packed up and went to cities, especially northern cities. We read and saw in Jacobs that the North wasn't without racism, but it was a different form. And there were different kind of legal means and opportunities there. So that's one aspect to think about. The other one is what we call the lynching era, or again, this is, use it as a historical category, but we all know, especially if you've been paying attention to the news, lynching wasn't like something that happened and that's it. But there was a high prevalence of public lynchings during that time. Ida B. Wells, if you're familiar with her at all, wrote a red record and did one of the very first studies and kind of documentation of lynching throughout the South. This is something that the PBS video looked at a little bit, but that was another driving force, right? There was very visceral kind of reactions to the freedom, or the supposed freedom that Black people were now had after the Civil War. And so the public lynchings were another way that people exercised their power over Blackness. But those public lynchings, again, reminded people of the violence that threatened them. And so, again, that was a push factor for a lot of people to begin migrating. You're all very familiar with kind of voting disenfranchisement and a lot of the other debates that were going on in this era. But these are some of the contributing factors that kind of further distinguished how people viewed the North as a space for Black people versus the South, although we'll get into what that really meant as we look at geographic segregation. I want to spend just a short time talking to you about the Black codes. I'm going to play this clip from PBS because it does a good job of explaining why these in particular are, the Black codes and the pig laws are significant for shaping the way Blackness and Black people existed within many southern spaces, and why it is that many of them fled north. So I'm going to play, and hopefully this should work. I'm going to play. So I apologize, when I went to put this on full screen, it actually cut the video recording out. So I'm going to have to play this somewhat smaller. Hopefully I can piece together the videos for you, but if not, I apologize if they're separate. But I'm going to play this clip for you from PBS.
But even after African Americans began to be a part of the political process, the state legislatures of the South passed more and more and more restrictive measures which were effectively designed to criminalize Black life, to make it essentially impossible for any African American man who didn't live under the explicit protection of some white landowner to not be in violation of some law at almost all times. And the kinds of things we're talking about are absurd to modern ears, but it was a crime in the South for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad. It was a crime in the South to speak loudly in the company of white women. It was a crime to sell the products of your farm after dark, almost anywhere in the South. There were reasons, there were sort of odd logics behind almost all of these laws, and none of them said that they applied exclusively to African Americans. But overwhelmingly, they were only ever enforced against African Americans because the explicit intent, when I say the intent was explicit, It was. In the Constitutional Convention of Alabama in 1901, when a new constitution was passed, which effectively ended all black participation in political life and public life in Alabama, the discussions around the drafting of these laws were very open about the intention of to make it impossible for black men to participate in mainstream American life in any meaningful way. But the most powerful, the most damaging of all of these laws were the vagrancy statutes, where in every southern state it became a crime, or you became a criminal, if you could not prove at any given moment that you were employed. What white Southerners then discovered was that this was also an extraordinarily effective way of intimidating African Americans away from the new civil rights they had obtained as a result of the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War. These laws passed to force them back into labor also intimidated them away from the political process, or could be used to intimidate them away from the political process. And so by the end of the 19th century, on the basis of these two strategies of white Southerners, enormous populations of African Americans had been returned to a state of de facto slavery and had been effectively pushed completely, entirely out of the political process, and they would not return for 6 decades.
So I won't play the other clip, although I encourage you to check out. PBS has some great videos explaining the black codes and the pig laws. But as you hear in there, I mean, it was something as simple as not walking by a railroad. There were laws about gathering in certain numbers, talking loudly in the presence of a white woman. The pig laws made it so that if you were caught stealing a pig, what may have before been a misdemeanor was now a felony, right? So becomes a way to control the way that black people existed in southern spaces. So you were either forced to take jobs that were sharecropping, or essentially you made no money. Anything you made went to cover your housing, right, or your food, which is another kind of, de facto form of slavery. Or you were, put in positions where you could be put into jail and then you were a slave of the state. So this need to escape those confines, not to mention the threat of lynching and other ways that kind of your life was under threat, these ways that blackness and black life were policed in many southern spaces, drove a lot of Black Americans to just migrate north, right? So people tend to look at the Great Migration, and again, black codes and pig laws and the Great Migration are terms you should know. I try to make sure I point these out in lectures so that way if it shows up on an exam, you're not wondering where that came from. But the Great Migration, many people will look at it in terms of two different migrations. So, the first initial one, you had a little over 2 million African Americans migrating to northern cities. But then if you look at the second one, or if you look at it up through the 70s, you have over 6 million Black Americans moving from the rural South to northern cities. You also have people moving from the rural South to, southern cities, but much more migration to the north. And as I mentioned, these people are driven by, anti-Black terrorism, economic oppression, segregation, the threat of re-enslavement through the prison system. So there's very, concrete ways or reasons why people migrated. And I'll show you this map to kind of get an idea of the different places people went. Obviously, many of you being New Yorkers, you won't be surprised that people make their way there, but people often forget that the large kind of Black populations you have in places like Chicago, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, right? These are places that have pretty strong Black populations. The reasons why is traced back to this history of some of this early migration, right? Moving up for opportunity. But what we find out in looking at geographic and housing segregation is what those dreams of opportunity really turned into. So what I want to turn to now is this conversation we'll be having this semester of what the streets are and how they were made, right? So today's lecture and the PBS video and a lot of this week's study are really getting at this question of like, how were the streets made? And if we consider the streets to be not just the geographic space of kind of urban Black belonging, but also all the cultural and social and political meanings tied to it, how did this come to be? I always like to start this conversation, we're going into some history and talk about some things, but to conceptualize what I mean and what we're really looking forward to. And I think one of the best people to articulate what the streets are, and how they are traced back to, you know, uh, geographic segregation is Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I'm hoping many of you have read Between the World and Me. It's an excellent book. We're going to look at an early version of an essay that's kind of the first half of the book, that's made available online. But let me read this quote, because this is really essentially what we're getting at when we talk about the streets, right? So Coates says, they're not just physical blocks, nor simply the people who packed into them, but the array of lethal puzzles and strange perils that seem to rise up from the asphalt itself. The streets transform every ordinary day into a series of trick questions, and every incorrect answer risks a beatdown, a shooting, or a pregnancy. No one survives unscathed, and yet the heat that springs from the constant danger, from a lifestyle of near-death experience, is thrilling. This is what the rappers mean when they pronounce themselves addicted to the streets or in love with the game. And of course, he's using poetic language here, but what he's getting at is both kind of this love for one space and what that turns into, right? And the ways that people perform that. But the streets being about not just where Black people were made to live through geographic segregation, but all of the conditions that were tied to that, right? So limited opportunity, the perceived violence, but that really comes from public policy, right? Not some inherent deficiency in Black people. All of these things you can trace back directly to public policy. And so I think that Coates does a really good job of framing what we're going to look at this semester is how do we trace things like, hip hop and literature and educational opportunity and, the wealth gap back to these questions of policies that created which spaces Black people were allowed to live in and which ones they weren't. So let's take a look at those. I wanted to start with something that the video hints at, the PBS video, but it doesn't exactly dig into it. So, hold on one second. So the PBS video really starts with this question of federal housing subsidization, but I want to start back with the actual projects themselves. And a couple of you mentioned this in some of your early posts, but often when you think about Black space, right, or the words that come to mind, people think of the projects or the hood, things like that, right? But what you might not know is that originally the projects were not designed for Black people, right? So early on, housing projects, which are just subsidized government public housing, were restricted to only people who worked in military factories, who worked for the government, and these were only available to white Americans. So Black people were not allowed to live in that housing. What's interesting is back then, and we're talking early 1900s, when it was only for white Americans, it wasn't the kind of, ubiquitous design we think of now of high rises, right? These were single family homes. They were, not high rise, but low to the ground. So they kind of gave the similar image you have of like, here's a white single family working for the government, right? Very different perception of white space, even though it's subsidized government housing, right? So eventually it opens up to people who don't just work for the government, but it becomes a larger public good, but it was still really restricted and Black Americans didn't have access. And this was administered by the Public Works Administration. So essentially, if I'm summarizing this instead of digging, I could talk about this history quite a bit. The PWA under Harold Ickes over time made it so that Black Americans could have access to public housing, but it took a lot of fighting, right? And so in many ways, getting access to the projects, being allowed to live there was seen as an early victory because it meant that Black people had access to this public good that was formerly only for white Americans. Now, there's this long history where, in order to gain access, it had to be segregated, and they had these racial composition rules where if you built housing projects in a neighborhood, if the neighborhood was white, then the projects could only be for white people. If it was integrated or black, then it was only for black people. But they kept things separate, right? And they had many kind of rationales as to why. Largely, the kind of myth that, well, it's better for people if they just live amongst their own kind, right? But even with all of that, getting entrance and being able to access that public good was seen as a victory. What happens simultaneously, though, is after World War II, again, we had another boom. People were demanding housing. The reason why public housing originally opened up beyond just government workers is because after World War I, you had all these people who we had a housing shortage, and so it opened things up. Well, similarly, after World War II, you had people coming back from the war, you have baby boomers being born, we had housing shortages. So what happens is we get two kind of policies, right? And you won't be surprised to see what happens. So under President Truman, his Truman Act of 1949, you get a couple of housing measures passed. One is the support of new programs to construct over 800,000 public housing units, right? So a massive expansion of projects or public housing. But in that same kind of policy after World War II, you get the subsidization of home loans through the FHA and HOLC, which we'll talk about in a second. So what happens is it's precisely when Black people now have access to public housing that it becomes there's a way to resegregate so that white Americans now have access to these home ownership loan programs, and Black Americans only have access to public assistance if they want to live in the projects or if they want to rent, right? So you can imagine how that led today to questions of Blackness is tied to the projects or living in urban and renting and not owning anything, and whiteness becomes tied to homeownership, the suburbs, and a lot of things that we saw in that PBS video. But it all stems from these early policies and the shift that as soon as Black Americans gained access to public housing, we see a change in what the projects become. All of a sudden, the projects are no longer these single-family homes that resemble every other house, right? But we get these dense, high-rise buildings in cities, right? So this is where we get that common image today, like what I have on the screen, where you see, okay, this is what the projects are, right? These high-rises where there's only, Black and brown people living. This is that origin. That wasn't what projects were originally intended to be, but as soon as kind of Black people gained access, that's the road they took. And then there created this alternative path for white Americans. So I won't go into all of this because the video did a good job of digging into a lot of this. But essentially, what I want to highlight are a few of the different ways that government policies created the streets, right? So one, we talked about Public Works Administration. We talked about how they were responsible for overseeing the projects and how getting Black people into the projects, but then making it so that they were dense high rises is one way that we see the creation of a specific kind of Black space, right, or racialized space. Simultaneously, we had the creation of the Federal Housing Authority and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So HOLC was created for people who already owned homes to help them to refinance and to make it more affordable, right? You'll know that before this, homeownership was very limited because you had to be able to pay about 50% down on your home, and you had 5 to 7 years to pay that off, right? If you can imagine that now, not many people will be owning homes, right? So what we now kind of know, the idea that you pay 10 to 20% down and that you can pay off your mortgage over 30 years, that's what the FHA kind of created, modern mortgage terms. Although even now, if you're a first-time home buyer, the FHA allows you to have a 3 to 5% down payment, right? So this, you cannot underestimate how radically this changed access to homeownership. It meant that your average person could purchase a home and pay it off over time and build equity because they were paying on the principal of that home loan. What this meant is not only did it create an avenue for white Americans, because it was limited, to own homes, but it essentially created middle class identity and tied it to whiteness, because homeownership, the space of living in the suburbs, and of building up your wealth through home equity all become tied to this new formation of middle class identity in the US. So this is what, at least on the federal level, government housing policies were doing. You'll notice a couple of images here, and we're going to look at some of these later. The image right here on the far right on the bottom, we'll talk about that because long before these policies came to be, there were all these campaigns to really tie owning a home to being kind of a good white American, right? A real patriot with a family, and 2.5 kids. So we'll talk about that. I think next week is when we're getting into that actually, but I'll talk slightly about that in a second. But you'll notice these very drastic images of then how neighborhoods were beginning to be formed. The video mentioned the 8 Mile, right, where white residents didn't want to lose value in their neighborhood, so they constructed a wall to separate themselves, to literally segregate themselves from an adjacent black neighborhood, and their home values went up, right? So you can't underestimate just how significant these policies were. So another thing next week we'll look at, I'm just giving you a preview here, we'll circle back to this image actually, is the kitchen debates. And this is an image of Khrushchev and Nixon together at a display where the US was showing off, what makes the US great. And a key component of that was a display of the homes that are available under these new FHA programs. Again, we'll talk more about the kitchen debates later, but to the extent that Cold War politics were a part of that conversation was the availability of homeownership. But as we're seeing through the PBS video and what we're talking about today, that availability was limited to white Americans. Now, what's interesting is that this was a time that actually helped a lot of people who weren't previously considered fully white then kind of be seen as actually white and middle class. So in the video, they talked a little bit about early kind of immigration of Southern and Eastern Europeans who were seen as kind of segregated, right? And even Jewish groups that were seen as, adjacent to whiteness, but not quite white. And then you get the melting pot theory in, the 1910s. And then with these loan programs, people move into the suburbs, and they talked about in the video, all of a sudden, everybody there kind of began to create an identity about being white, about living in the suburbs, about having families. And so this is where you have the emergence of a white middle class that no longer distinguished as much between different white ethnic groups. The other thing I want to point out to you is some of the imagery here of what's tied to these suburban developments like Levittown, which they mentioned. It's probably one of the most well-known examples of the suburban kind of white homeownership that was being created at the time. And to know that it wasn't just the house itself, but you'll notice the advertisement for the kitchen and the appliances and the furniture. So it's not just home ownership at this time, right? It's this other ad here, General Electric. It's not just home ownership, right? But it's all the ideas that come along with it, right? It's that you're going to be a consumer of certain home goods. It's that you see this lovely white couple here and he's in his uniform. It's that you're a patriot. It's that you have, your lovely wife and kids. So all of this becomes wrapped up in the notion of the suburbs. And this is what people dream and seek when they apply for these loans. And largely that's what they get, right? So in contrast, right, so as I talk about in the video, this language of, white Americans are being invested in this whole dream, the kind of new American dream of the white picket fence and the house and 2.5 kids, black Americans are being divested from that, right? So they're being pushed into these high-rise apartments and projects. They're being, divested from ownership. A lot of public programs and resources are being taken out of those communities, right? Their public things are not being funded. And so this is the kind of divergent point where you see a very drastic contrast in the way white and black space were being defined. Now, we talked a little bit on the federal level, right? So $120 billion in new housing, less than 2% goes to Black Americans. But I want to make sure I point out two other key things. It wasn't just federal, right? So state obviously has happened the same way in state policies, funding, as well as in state constitutions. You have in law, you have the same kind of segregationist policies that were at work, and the same redlining practices where, they define Black neighborhoods as being the risky red ones, and they defined, the white, least risk, the green neighborhoods, as being the white neighborhoods. You should know from this lecture and from the PBS video what redlining are. You should also know white flight and blockbusting. So blockbusting, if you saw in the video they talked about, is when you'd have realtors. So on a private practice, right? This isn't a state, this isn't federal, but these are private practice real estate agents would go into a neighborhood and say, you know what, I saw some Black people moved in, they're looking at your thing, you might want to move, I'll buy your house from you for this really cheap price, right? So they do that, and they can bust up the block and buy real estate really cheap and turn around and sell it to people, either to Black Americans who think that's a desirable neighborhood because it used to be white, so they sell it to them at really poor rates that take advantage of them, or they can turn around and sell it to white Americans, but usually that wasn't the case. White flight is the reaction to that blockbusting, where you have a Black person move into your neighborhood and they think, great, this is an economic neighborhood that's great for me, good resources, but because the Black person moved in, they get scared, so they sell their home and they flee to the suburbs, right? That's white flight. So these things work together so that even when you have kind of Black middle class folks, we already saw the barriers. You don't have access to the federal loan programs. So to get to own a home, you really have to either be fighting these kind of legal battles to try to get access to some of the loan stuff, or have enough economic means that you could buy a home from a private lender. And so even if they manage to get through all of those hoops and they want to go buy in a white neighborhood, what happens is they make that investment, but because of blockbusting and white flight, their investment has no value or very little value in contrast to their white counterparts. As soon as they move in the neighborhood and everybody else leaves, then that house they purchased loses value. So over time, they're not able to build up the same equity as white people of the same economic status. The other thing, the other practice, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this, are housing covenants. And I just want to show you this really great image that the University of Minnesota did, where they show you over time, in my city at least, right, where housing covenants throughout the 20th century grew over time to help keep out Black Americans from buying homes. So the blue areas, this is where they developed these covenants, right? And look at it over time. You just see it increasing and increasing. And these are valuable properties next to big lakes that are well known. By the river here, this is still a highly segregated white neighborhood. So all of these kind of desirable spaces become predominantly white spaces, even within the city, right? And then over time, I'm going to pause this when it gets towards the end so I can show you a little bit about my own city and neighborhood. Oops. See if I can get this all the way. So over time, you'll notice this is the suburbs over here, right? Keeping out, and this is on the edge of the city. Way out here, you didn't have to do this as much, but on the edge of the city in these suburbs, you have all these covenants to make sure that Black people do not leave the city itself. But no, this is essentially a wall to say you are restricted. You must stay here in the city, except for the very desirable parts of the city by these nice lakes. This neighborhood, Longfellow, it still remains one of the most difficult neighborhoods for Black people to get into. A friend of mine who's Black actually owns a house there, and in her, when she bought her house, the deed had the old documents of the covenant that said that no one in the future could sell the house to a Negro, right, or someone of the Negroid race. So my friend bought this and thought it was hilarious, but even today in her deed, there's that history in the document that way back then someone said, I never want this land sold to a Black person. I'll also point out to you all, in case you're curious, these neighborhoods where you don't see these covenants are the predominantly black neighborhoods in Minneapolis and North Minneapolis as well. Right here, this is where George Floyd was murdered, right? So even today, you have these continue to be the neighborhoods that black people are restricted to, and we continue to see the images of the people who live there, right? A man going to buy something who is seen as, a criminal and loses his life because of it, because he's living his life existing in this space. So the point of this, and again, I want to remind you, you should know FHA housing policies. You should know what changed about mortgages. If I ask you what redlining are, blockbusting, white flight, those are terms you should know. And you should also know that it wasn't just this federal policy. On local levels, you have these covenants, and then real estate agents and private practices, as well as private banks, they often took the maps. I'm going to go back. Sorry if this makes you dizzy. I know Prezi makes some people dizzy. They took maps like this, and even though Hulk and the FHA created these maps for government entities to use, private banks actually took the lead from the government and said, we will use these exact same maps when we are defining who we will give loans to. So in private sector as well, this is how you continue the practice of geographic segregation. So all of these things work together to define black and white space in these radically different ways. So let's talk about the significance of this, right? I talked to you a little bit about what this means for white Americans. We know this, the video explained. You live in a neighborhood where you have higher home values over generation and generation, as George Lipsitz points out. That is, between, what did they say, 1990 and today, $9 trillion was inherited by the descendants of white Americans who were the beneficiaries of these policies. That is a lot of money. It's not just that inheritance though, right? That money is used to start businesses, right? And we can think of businesses that people, even very rich people today, started because they were able to get a loan from their parents. It means better schools. It means retirement funds. It means college funds, things to invest and build your investment portfolio, right? All these things we don't often think about. That equity, that wealth that most people have comes directly from either their home value or the wealth that was passed down to them through homeownership. Even if you think about it today, and I won't make you think about your own circumstances or people you know, it's not true of everybody, but statistically speaking, it's more common that white Americans might have an aunt or an uncle or someone in their family who passes. They sell the home and they get, even if it's a modest inheritance of $10,000, $20,000, and they can use that to do something. Most black Americans still to this day do not have that. So it continues this growing wealth gap, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But I think above that are these questions of, or alongside that I should say, these perceptions of what black and white space really mean, right? So I put some of the public perceptions and narratives down here so that you can kind of keep that in mind, right? So we already knew, right, from these maps that particularly black people, but also indigenous and other people of color, were seen, their neighborhoods were made a financial risk. And even though legally we've moved away from racial segregation with the 1968 Fair Housing Act, this perception of BIPOC people being an economic risk, that's a narrative that persists, right? And I'll give you an example of that in just a bit. But one of you mentioned this in your post, and I was excited to see it. Even today, if you close your eyes and imagine, or if you Google or you look at any movie or film, suburban living or suburbia is tied to whiteness and typically kind of white heterosexual families with kind of these shared values. They're family oriented, they have opportunities and dream and go to college. And again, I'm giving you broad sweeps here. I know this is not the case for everybody, but it's about the pattern and the definition of these spaces, right? In contrast, blackness is tied to urban living in space, but there's this perception, instead of having kind of shared values and morals, they're seen as having deficiencies, limitations, poor single parent families, right? We're going to talk more about these narratives for sure. But this is the genesis of all of this. And I often argue to people, not argue, but say to people that alongside slavery and mass incarceration, geographic segregation is one of the top influencing factors that shapes Black life today, because it shapes everything from the way Black people are seen to where they belong to the opportunities they have. I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. So if you I'm gonna give you some examples over time, right? So we know in the video they talked about the fact that in 1968 LBJ signed the Fair Housing Act, and yes, legally these practices ended, but the perceptions tied to people in space and then the private practices of this did not end. So let's walk through history even after this. So in 1985, 20 years after the Fair Housing Act was signed, the Michigan State Democratic Party, right? So they're Democrats, surveyed members of their party, working white class members, to really understand how working white class people viewed Black people. And they found overwhelmingly that the people they interviewed expressed, quote, a profound distaste for Blacks and a sentiment that pervades almost everything they think about government and politics. They saw being Black as, they saw not being Black as being middle class, and not living with Black people is what makes a neighborhood a decent place to live. And I'm quoting from their survey. This is what they found. That's in 1985, so you might think, okay, well, that was still quite a while ago. But that's 20 years after we ended these legal practices. The perceptions of Blackness and being middle class was the opposite of that, right? These are white working class folks who were trying to make their way into middle classness, but they tied that distinctly to whiteness, right? So let's move a little bit later and look at 2001. So these sociologists they did this kind of massive study nationally, and they wrote this great book actually, and several articles looking at this question of housing segregation. And they found overwhelmingly that when they surveyed folks, white Americans still viewed racial composition as more significant than property values, schools, crime rates, or even class composition when they were deciding where they wanted to buy a home. They also found this threshold of what percentage of a neighborhood could be Black that white people would tolerate, and it was just 15%. So when they surveyed people, even in 2001, as long as the neighborhood was under 15%, people tolerated it, but over 15%, they still found white Americans did not want to live there because they didn't see it as a desirable space. More recently, and this is just in 2012 because the HUD only publishes so often, they still find even today that Black home buyers are shown fewer homes than white people, and they face greater scrutiny of their financial records. You maybe saw in the news, it may have been a couple weeks ago, there was this article that a Black woman published. She's married to a white man, where they had to have their home valued, and she had the appraiser come in, and he looked at her house, her photos of her Black family. She had different Black kind of historical figures posted up, and gave her a very low figure. Well, she kind of knew what was up, so she went back, hid all her photos, hid all her stuff, and had her white husband be there when a different appraiser came. And the home was appraised at, I think it was $130,000 or $150,000 more, right? That is an incredible difference. And this is a woman today who at least knew enough to do that, but there are hundreds of thousands of Black Americans who, if they do manage to own a home, right, because homeownership is just over 40% for Black Americans today, so not a lot. If they do manage to own a home, have to face still the discrimination of lower home values. When they go to buy, the scrutiny and discrimination of, can you really afford this, right? So they get lower loans. The other thing, which I told you I would circle back to in private practice, is predatory loans, or if you remember the Wells Fargo case that happened a couple years back, where they use the internal language themselves of quote unquote ghetto loans, right? And these are marketed to Black buyers with higher interest rates and horrible terms. Particularly, these were they happened a lot in the early 2000s, and that's part of what led to the 2008 financial crisis. But they give people these loans with these horrible terms that they could barely afford, and then they would make it so that later they could just profit off the interest, or they would be able to foreclose on their homes later, right? And even the language of internal documents they found from this private lender of calling them ghetto loans is the perception that just sheer by de facto, because you are black, right, you are seen as ghetto. And that's an interesting concept when you think it to this question, this history of geographic segregation, because the history of confining black people to urban spaces, to the streets, to the ghetto, then takes on this meaning where blackness itself becomes a ghetto, right? It becomes a segregated identity with these very negative connotations. And we're going to spend a lot of time in the coming weeks looking at the way that Black people resist and challenge that, often successfully, right? But there are, as you can see through some of the examples I'm giving, still persistent issues of disparities and oppression that result from this. The last slide, I think I want to point out to you, is the economic impact, right? And I've referenced this quite a bit. I think it's worth pointing out. In the video, this video, the PBS video was published, or I think it was produced in 2003. It looks a little bit older, but it's been a while, right? It's almost 20 years. Now, I think they said Black people had 7 or 8% the wealth of their white counterparts. It has only gotten worse since then, right? So I'm going to show you actually two things. I have median wealth by race and then degree in race, because often people think, well, you just have to get the right job, the right income, you work your way up. But research has shown that even if you get the right job, the right income, this disparity in your wealth, right, has a great impact on how far you can kind of, work your way up, so to speak. For instance, if you don't have that family wealth to help you pay for college, right? Or if you didn't have access to the right classes because you didn't live in the right neighborhood to get into a good school, that means that your economic, sorry, that's my dog shaking. I knew in one of these videos he was going to do that. You don't have the same access to go to certain schools, which means you may end up making less money. But let's say even you do manage to make the same money. Right now, there have been studies on the disproportionate amount of debt that Black college graduates have, because to get to, getting a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD, getting a good job, they have to take on higher debt because they don't have the same generational wealth as their white counterparts. So even when you get to income equality or degree in education, you still have these mass disparities, right? And so I've shown you a couple images from the Economic Policy Institute. But I think the most interesting and telling thing is this figure down here, and I don't know if it'll let me click on it. So today, well, this was actually carried out in a couple years ago. So I think it was before Trump was elected, so I don't know if things have changed. But not that long ago, a Yale psychology study found that most people have a drastic misunderstanding or misperception of how far we've progressed. So this is perception over here. They found that they surveyed people and found that most people thought that the disparity was somewhere around 85%. So that, Black people had 85% of the wealth of their white counterparts. In reality today, Black Americans have 5% of the wealth of their white counterparts. So $5 for every $100, that's how much family wealth, right? And again, this is an average. So that means that's taking into account the very rich and wealthy Black folks that are out there, in contrast to the very poor who have negative or zero net worth, right? Income, there's still disparities, obviously, that's not a surprise, but they do a good job of showing what happens in terms of your wages of your, high school versus college education level, your income overall. But this is the largest disparity. The issue today, we still have questions of disparities in educational opportunity and income, but the biggest kind of racial economic disparity facing us is this wealth gap, because over generation and generation and generation, that wealth that white Americans built originally from owning and having access to these loans, and then being able to use their home values to invest, start companies, things like that, that has only grown exponentially since the 1940s. And so now we're at a place where this wealth gap really can only be addressed with like a drastic solution, because there's a 95% difference, right? This is something to consider when we kind of keep going through, and people, I think, I guess I'll leave it at this. As we go throughout the semester and we look at the different way that Black artists and authors think about their experiences and their life and their identity living within Black urban spaces, consider what it's like to live and know these realities, and then find a way to kind of negotiate and find value in yourself, while also acknowledging these are very real structural barriers that you and your people are facing, right? So how do you find value in yourself and believe you can make it, while also knowing you have 5% of the wealth that white people have, right? So there's kind of this constant battle and contrast of acknowledging the very real limitations and forces around you, while still struggling for something better. And I think that that's a tension we're going to kind of continue to trace and analyze throughout the rest of the semester. So I'll wrap things up here. And again, this video was meant to talk about both the larger context for this week, lay some historical groundwork for the rest of the semester, and then also the PBS video. So if you have questions, as always, email me or post them below. But hopefully this helped flesh some of those concepts out for you a bit more.